Hi, everybody. Welcome back to English 229. This is for our class for Wednesday, the 17th, where I wanted to talk about Lovecraft. And I also wanted to anticipate the next reading that we will be doing, which is The Haunting of Hill House by Shirley Jackson. So, in terms of our syllabus, you would have a journal due for Lovecraft, but I wanted to give a little bit of an extension for that. So now your journal will be due on Monday, the 22nd. That gives us time to talk a little bit about Lovecraft today, and also for me to put some resolution on Lovecraft next class. And you can see in the notes below, I've included 3 links to the Lovecraft stories if it turns out that you don't have access to a text. And the 3 that I chose were The Outsider and Pickman's Model, and then lastly, I chose The Dunwich Horror. And all of these, I think, illustrate some interesting ideas that we've been talking about over the course of the Gothic. And as I've been suggesting that our examination of Gothic literature, as Stephen King talks about as well in Danse Macabre, is an examination of the fears and anxieties of their particular time. I think we've seen that in many of the Gothic texts that we've read. And in fact, several of you have commented on that, for instance, in Dracula, and how misogynistic Dracula happens to be, and xenophobic Dracula happens to be. And that's because it reflects its society and the fear society had of other or outsider, whether it be a foreigner or whether it be female, invading and changing their way of life, so to speak. So the irony is that Lovecraft, in at least the very beginning of his career, was very xenophobic. He was not xenophobic at the ending of his career. He became much more progressive. And if you are familiar with a television series on HBO called Lovecraft Country, which I highly recommend, it basically is based on the segregation and discrimination that existed in the 1950s. It's actually a great 1950s historical snapshot, but it's set in what they call Lovecraft Country. So it's basically taking the idea of H.P. Lovecraft, who's known for his xenophobia, and usurping that and basically retelling Lovecraft through a different kind of lens. So I highly recommend that if you have an option to do that. But notice that Lovecraft is important for us, if for no other reason. He began the semester with supernatural horror and literature, which laid out many of the elements that we associate with what is considered supernatural literature. So ultimately, that's going to be today's attendance question, is my asking you if you think that, at least based on just these 3 short stories, and obviously he has much, much more to read, just like Edgar Allan Poe, but at least based on these 3 short stories, do you think he lives up to the criteria that he establishes? But I'll talk a little bit more about that later. We also know that Lovecraft is an Anglophile, and he likes to mimic the speech patterns of the British, even though Lovecraft is an American. And he was very fascinated with the past, so oftentimes his constructions will seem rather archaic. One of the things he does in The Outsider is he gives us an opening quote by Keats. And I think that's important because Lovecraft is trying to establish himself within the literary tradition. It's something that we saw that Edgar Allan Poe did as well. We have an eye narrator. That's also similar to Edgar Allan Poe. And we have a story that's full of atmosphere with a castle and twilight and full moon, isolation, and a graveyard. So all of the tropes in many respects that we've come to expect from the Gothic tradition. And what we end up finding out through the twist, and the twist is put in italics at the ending of the story. I wish that sometimes Lovecraft wasn't quite so obvious about where the twist is, but he definitely makes sure that we pay attention. That while we assume that the narrator is encountering monstrosity after it escapes a kind of prison, it turns out that the narrator himself is the monstrosity, an old idea that we've seen in the Gothic, that we ourselves are the monster, and that the prison is a tomb, a crypt, in effect, and that basically the narrator is dead and he doesn't realize that he's dead. Perhaps one of the greatest horrors is that you're dead and you don't even necessarily know it. We know how Poe was concerned with premature burial, so I think that Lovecraft sort of played around with that idea as well. And the fact of our narrator being the outsider, I think, fits in very well with the theme of this semester, that anything that's considered to be other or different is considered to ultimately be terrifying. And whether it's terrifying that there's consciousness in death, or whether it's terrifying that there is some sort of a life after death, you can decide for yourselves. But I think that definitely this particular piece, one of the reasons why I wanted to include it was because of this idea of what is outsider, what is normal and abnormal. And of course, within our own perceptions, we are normal, and everything outside of ourselves is abnormal. So I think I might have mentioned this with the Twilight Zone episode early on in the semester, where beauty is in the eye of the beholder, where basically a woman is undergoing plastic surgery, and after the plastic surgery, her face is revealed, and she would seemingly be classified as quite a beautiful woman. And then the camera pans out to the doctors, and we see the doctors from our perception would be hideous monstrosities. And of course, that which is different from ourselves is usually what we consider monstrosity. But there also is the idea that we want to belong to the norm. So obviously, this woman, while she would be viewed beautiful in our culture and would be viewed as abnormal in her culture, because the majority views abnormality as her appearance, obviously she is trying to fit in with the majority perception, at least in this particular episode. So in Pickman's model, one of the reasons why I wanted to assign this particular piece is because there is an old linkage between art and the supernatural. And I think I might have mentioned this to you, that if we had time this semester, I would have assigned The Picture of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde, which is a wonderful examination about the way that art can basically tap into supernatural realms. One of the things that makes Lovecraft appealing for many people is that he sets his tales in real places, not fictional places, though he will create fictional elements in those real places. I was talking about things like Miskatonic University, for instance, which doesn't exist, but it's supposed to bring forth images of places like Harvard University and Brown University. And he does set Pickman's model in Boston. So anybody who is familiar with New England, and of course New England is the place where the new traditions of Old England were being established. That's why we call it the New England. It's the oldest part of our country. So this is where you're going to find the most history in our country. And once again, we've got the I narrator, in this instance, Thurber, maintaining that they are sane. But unlike Poe, when we find out that the narrator is insane, one of the things about Lovecraft is that the supernatural is real. There is no ambiguity. And the narrator, as he continues to maintain his sanity, proves that he's sane, unlike the way that Poe's narrators can do, where he talks about an ancient evil and associations with the supernatural. So that if you are familiar with the supernatural, some of the references in the text, things like Salem is probably best known for their witch trials, and vampirism as well, are mentioned in this particular text. And the idea is that Thurber ends up meeting a Pickman who is an artist who is drawing these grotesque images. And what we see in this story, as we oftentimes see in Lovecraft, is a suspension of nature's laws. That is what supernatural is. Through kind of a reverse evolution, where we see these monstrosities are basically our past heritage. And Lovecraft creates this mythology where before our existence, human existence, there was a monstrosity existence that is still trying to vie for power. Again, the twist ending is in italics, where it turns out that Pickman is basically getting the models for his pictures through photographs. In other words, these are real images that he happens to be painting, not elements of his imagination, because he's living in an old area in Boston where he is able to access into another dimension and actually see these monstrosities. Then I had assigned the Dunwich Horror, and I assigned that. I know it's the longer of the three texts, in part so that you could get a sense of that mythical world that Lovecraft creates. And we have an opening quote that talks about archetypes. Again, Lovecraft is very fond of talking about past influences in our present. And archetypes, if you know anything about psychology and Carl Jung, are supposed to be these ancient, and in some ways, biological impulses and images that exist from generation to generation. And this story is divided up into multiple sections, and it takes place in north central Massachusetts in a place called Dunwich. Now, and one of his stories, I didn't assign one of these stories, but in this particular story, it talks about a train ride, and one of the stops is in Greenfield, Massachusetts. So that gives you an idea, again, of how Lovecraft oftentimes sets his tales in very real locales to give it a sense of realism. And we're introduced to a Dr. Armitage who could be very similar to a Van Helsing figure that we saw in Dracula. That is somebody who can embrace science, but also can embrace the supernatural. And this story perhaps most clearly illustrates some of Lovecraft's xenophobia and discrimination and racism. He talks about abnormality in the backwaters of New England, that there's inbreeding and degeneracy and decadence. And this is a quote: "The natives are repellently decadent and are on a path of retrogression in many New England backwaters." So that gives you an idea of what he thinks of places like Western Massachusetts. Again, he became much more liberal in his views as he neared the ending of his life, and he traveled a bit. Prior to that, he basically didn't leave the area of eastern of places like eastern Massachusetts and also Rhode Island. So, and again, what not only references to connections between Miskatonic and Harvard, there's also a mention to the Boston Globe, and next to that is a mention of the Arkham Advertiser. The idea that the Arkham Advertiser, which is fictional, is basically has the same kind of cachet and influence as the Boston Globe. Lots of references to pagan days in this text, things like Candlemas or May Eve, which, a side note, is when A Midsummer Night's Dream takes place in May, which is basically midsummer. It's at the time when the day is longest, and it's a time of great celebration. If you've ever heard about dancing around the maypole, that's one of the ways that celebration is honored. And the maypole, a little piece of trivia that you may or may not know, is a phallic symbol, because May Day is supposed to be a day of great fertility, and that basically the best way to celebrate that fertility is through sexual union. So if you celebrated May Day in elementary school where you danced around a maypole, the holiday has much more significance than you were probably told of when you were an elementary school student. Also references, of course, to Halloween, and we talked about the importance of Halloween when we were near our Halloween. And just in general, black magic. And reference to that Necronomicon, that magic book that's supposed to be an ancient evil. And the fact is that Lovecraft talks about it in such a way, it seems like a real entity. In fact, there are individuals who have tried to actually find that Necronomicon. But it's not, it's a piece of fiction. Common Lovecraftian questions, and I think you can get this even from just the 3 stories that I assign. Who or what is the monster? And we get detailed descriptions of monstrosity in Lovecraft stories in a way we didn't get with Poe or with some of the other authors. We're told about green ichor. There's a lot of ichor in Lovecraft. This partly human, leathery hide figure that has greenish gray tentacles. This is part of the Cthulhu mythos, where Cthulhu is supposed to be this great monstrosity. We also get a diary entry in this story, and think about the importance of the epistolary novel in the Gothic tradition for things like Frankenstein and also Dracula. So there's a little bit of an homage to the epistolary technique. And we get 3 male scientists here. Lovecraft stories are almost always completely male. It's somewhat similar with Poe as well. And we get, and because Lovecraft was also a victim of sexism as well as racism, old, middle, and young. In some ways, you could say that these 3 scientists represent Trinity, and they also represent the 3 life stages of old, middle, and young. And we find out, again, here's our twist, that Wilbur Whately is not really the real monster. He was conceived through some sort of a monstrosity, through a black magic ritual. But that he has a twin brother that has been kept hidden and is now surfacing. that fits in with the idea of doubling and doppelganger that we've been talking about over the course of this semester. And a quote that I think is somewhat relevant is at the very ending of this particular piece, that we have no business calling in such things from the outside, and only very wicked people and very wicked cults ever try to. So this is Lovecraft's warning about how we should stay away from the supernatural. Now, what I thought I would do is leave Lovecraft at this particular point, and then what we could do is move on to something like hauntings, and that would help prepare you for our next text, which is The Haunting of Hill House. And you can see in the notes below, this is in section 4. I've got the link for The Haunting of Hill House, so if it turns out you don't have the text, here's the link and you can begin reading now. And what I wanted to do was to revisit Lovecraft and his quotations next class, and then also begin us with The Haunting of Hill House, and talk a little bit about Hollywood and the way that Hollywood has envisioned The Haunting of Hill House. But it's a great haunted house story. It's one that has inspired authors like Stephen King, if you're familiar with his haunted house story, The Shining. And we talked a little bit about the English ghost story during our Halloween session when we were talking about Monkey's Paw. And you can see that Shirley Jackson is very similar to the English ghost tradition in that there is a great amount of subtlety and restraint in her writing. The piece, you may or may not know, is based on a California house known as the Winchester House. And I have this in section 5 of our notes. It's even referenced in my version of The Haunting of Hill House on page 105. There's a website to the haunting or to the Winchester Mystery House if you wanted to see their website. It's become a tourist attraction. But I have a documentary that's just slightly under 13 minutes long. I guess that's appropriate when you think about some of the significances of 13 that I'd like you to watch. And that's in section 6, the Winchester House documentary entitled The History of the Winchester Mansion. So this will give you an idea of what the Winchester Mansion is and what it looks like and why it might have inspired someone like Shirley Jackson to talk about things like hauntings. Now Shirley Jackson supposedly was a self-professed witch, and she had quite an extensive library of occult books. So she was quite aware of many of the elements associated with the supernatural. And you may or may not be aware that the word haunt comes from the word home. So the haunt or the home is obviously central in this particular text. I'd argue that Hill House, which is the name of the home, is as central of a character as any of the other characters. And when hauntings occur is when we have inexplicable sensory phenomenon. Mostly, at least as they've been reported, they're not necessarily physical apparitions, but they're more likely to be things like smells and tactile sensations, things like the cold, and poltergeist activity. And poltergeist is from the German poltern, which means to knock, and geist, which is spirit. Basically, it's supposed to be a mischievous, sometimes a malevolent spirit or energy, oftentimes associated with young adolescent girls. Some of the speculation has been that during adolescence, particularly female, there are so many hormonal changes that females can tap into, if not supernatural realms, at least can tap into the paranormal. The idea that there are abilities that we possess as humans that we no longer have or are unable to tap into, but occasionally you can come across an individual who is able to do that. For instance, things like telekinesis, the moving of objects, for instance. So some of the events that are associated with poltergeist are things like rock throwing, odors, raps, physical and sexual assaults, shrieking, and spontaneous movement of objects. So the idea of a haunt is something that perhaps has been documented through the paranormal community, and there have been lots of explanations as to why these events might be occurring, whether or not it is an ability that some individuals have to tap into strengths and abilities that we no longer are able to tap into that we call supernatural, or whether it happens to be some sort of element of group psychosis where a group of individuals convince themselves that they're experiencing phenomenon. We talked about this in terms of Dracula as well. Or could it be some sort of restless spirit that is caught between two worlds? So there's lots of conjecture, but certainly there's a good amount of folklore and usually lots of anecdotal stories of individuals who, at least at one point or another in their life, can point to an episode where they've experienced something that can't necessarily be explained through natural means. So whether it is that energy left by the living after they die, whether it be that the house retains a memory as a kind of psychic battery, that's what Stephen King talks about, or whether it happens to be a lost soul or a portal to a spirit dimension that allows spirits to enter into the physical world. There are lots of possible explanations, but there are no concrete pieces of evidence. And Shirley Jackson plays on that idea, as well as the ambiguity associated with that, with our narrator, Ellie, who is quite unstable psychologically. Um, the idea that poltergeist activity could occur to a female under 20 because of unconscious thoughts or repressed emotions of hostility or anger, that's also another piece of conjecture. And that physical disturbances, again, could be caused by psychokinesis, the mind, things like flying, levitating, banging doors, rapping, thumping, assaults on humans. And I want you to keep all of this in mind, not just when we read The Haunting of Hill House, but also when we finally start with The Exorcist, because both of these are going to be important. So in terms of today's attendance question, which is due via our class discussion form, this is Wednesday, the 17th at 8 a.m. And you can see this is listed below. I'll remind you what Lovecraft said in Supernatural Horror and Literature. Lovecraft says that the best horror tales have naturalness, convincingness, artistic smoothness, skillful artistry with technique, craftsmanship, experience, psychological knowledge, exotic atmosphere, and supernatural element. Do you think that the three stories that I've assigned, The Outsider, Pickman's Model, and The Dunwich Horror, and you might be familiar with some other stories just based on your own reading, but at this point we can just concentrate on these three, though certainly feel free to reference others if you'd like. Do you think these three stories illustrate the elements that basically Lovecraft had indicated? And that'll be due on our discussion form by Wednesday at 8 a.m. Or I'm sorry, Thursday, and that's the 18th. I'm sorry, and that's at 8 a.m. So I hope you are all doing well. I'm doing well. Next class, we will continue by talking about or putting some closure onto H.P. Lovecraft. Do watch the documentary about the Winchester House because it's quite fascinating. And we will start talking a little bit more about Shirley Jackson. Take care. Bye-bye.